Hey guys, Bartell's Bookshelf here with my latest recent reads video. I'm sorry this has taken so long. It's just, I've been reading kind of slow and I've just been kind of down in the dumps lately, and you know how hard it is to be motivated to film something when you're a bit down. But I've got 4 books here that I'm going to talk about, and hopefully you guys find it interesting, so let's get into it. The first book I read was James A. Michener's The Novel. This was published in 1991. This is one of his later novels. As you might be able to tell, this is about the novel. Michener's novels tend to focus on historical things like countries or states or just historical periods, and they tend to take place over long periods of time, and they tend to be very detailed, lots of different characters. This is pretty similar to that, except this is all about the publication of a novel. This book talks about the writer Lucas Yoder, who is a older Pennsylvania Dutch author who's found success publishing a series of novels about the Amish. And he's currently finishing up the manuscript on his latest novel. And this book discusses the publication of that novel through a bunch of differing viewpoints, through the author, the editor, the critic, and the reader. And through that, it kind of just traces the publication of this novel. I run sort of hot and cold on Michener, at least what I've read so far. To be fair, all I've read of Michener so far was his Tales from the South Pacific book, which I was curious because it won the Pulitzer the year it came out. And I ran very hot and cold on that. I enjoyed half of it, and then the last half was really bogged down in like military strategy and like descriptions of military ordnance and things like that, and that's just not my jam. I've talked about that a little bit here and there. That's just really not my thing. So I thought that part of it kind of let me down a little bit. So I went into this with a little bit of trepidation, but I figured, it's shorter compared to his regular books. It's about 435 pages, as compared to his usual books, which are fucking chonkers, 800 to 1,000 pages, depending. So, and I've always been very interested in writing and the publication industry and stuff, so I thought this would be interesting. And I was right. I actually enjoyed this way more than I thought I would. It does start off a little slow. I didn't find the Lucas Yoder stuff in the beginning as interesting, although it does talk a lot about how, the thought process that goes into writing a novel, all the research that he does, things like that. And it does set up some things that are resolved later on in the book. But then once it got to the editor, things really started to pick up. The editor section focuses on his editor, Yvonne Marmel, who's this Jewish lady who grew up in New York, I think. And it talks about like her upbringing and how she was treated as a girl, how she was expected to fill certain roles as a girl, and it goes into like her love of literature and how she got into editing, and it ends up going into this really sad story about her former lover, I believe actually former husband, who was a struggling author. Who, as they put it, had the talent, he had the ability, but he couldn't put it into words. He spent years and years working on his great American novel and just always had trouble finishing it, and eventually kind of grew to resent Lucas Yoder, who she started representing and became a big sort of cash cow for her. And that whole scenario ends very tragically. I really enjoyed that. And the critic deals with a younger man, a writing teacher, a literature teacher at Mecklenburg College named Strebert, and he's obviously he's something of a radical. He has some very radical ideas about literature, about what constitutes literature versus just popular fiction, and because of that, he has kind of a very low view of Lucas Yoder. And they end up in some sort of minor intellectual spats over their disagreements on literature. This section also surprised me because I wasn't expecting this at all. But it ends up going into his backstory and how when he's a young man, he meets another older professor from England, an Irish professor, who helps him discover the fact that he's gay, and it goes into his relationship with this professor and how much he meant to him and how the professor eventually dies of AIDS, and it's like really tragic, and I was just really surprised to see something like that being discussed in this early 90s novel from a white cishet author, because I always thought of Michener, maybe incorrectly, as kind of, a very traditional old man who focuses very much on historical detail and not so much on character. But this section, again, like the previous section, really surprised me with the depth of feeling and character that he wrote about this gay man, writing outside of his experience. And it felt very real and very true, and it just honestly really surprised me, pleasantly surprised me. And then the final section, which focuses on the reader, which is kind of where everything comes together, focuses on this older woman who is a patron of the college. She had a very rich husband who died a while ago, and she inherited his like $30 million fortune or something like that. And she kind of uses her money and influence to support Mecklenburg College and kind of support the arts and things. And she has a young grandson that she adopted after his parents died in a car accident, who also wants to be a writer and is talked about in the previous section because he's a student of the college that Stribert teaches at. It goes into her feelings as a reader, as a fan of Lucas Yoder's novels, as just a fan of novels in general, about her reading habits, the way that she feels about novels, and how she kind of butts heads with her grandson and Stribert about sort of the incomprehensibility of like modern novels, how she believes in just having a good story, good characters, over sort of like theme, or like sort of being very incomprehensible and experimental in terms of form and structure and things like that. And this also brings in see, it mentions on the front here a good old-fashioned sink your teeth into it story, suspenseful. There's not really, it makes it sound like a suspense sort of mystery novel. There's an element of that at the end where someone is murdered and they have to sort of discover who did it, but that's really not the focus of the book. The thing that struck me about this, and the thing that I thought was really beautiful about it, was how it uses all these different characters to explore sort of the art of literature and storytelling and the importance of it, and why we read, and the different variations as to the different arguments as to what people consider literature. And as someone who's always been very interested in literary theory and literary criticism, I just gobbled it all up. It was just really endlessly fascinating to me. Maybe a little dry, but I think because it was a subject that I'm already very interested in, I didn't mind it, as opposed to, Tales from the South Pacific, which is all about World War II, and generally I'm not a big military guy. This really hooked me. And one of the things that I liked about it was that Michener, being kind of an older man at this point, writing these very big, sort of, some might say creaky historical novels, argues for a lot of different types of literature. He's not coming at it saying, the way that I write my books and the way that, I think about literature is the only correct way. Throughout this book, these characters are presented with alternating viewpoints on literature and what constitutes literature. And even if they all don't agree with each other, there's arguments given for every side. And some of the characters, like the grandmother, ends up sort of coming around to some of the more radical sides of Stribert and her grandson. Not necessarily 100% endorsing them, but understanding where they're coming from. And I thought that was really cool and really interesting, and something that I also feel very strongly about as somebody who, reads a lot of books and believes that, the whole perspective of what makes something literature, what makes something a classic, should be widened and broadened in scope, and everything should be an art. Art should never be approached with, a narrow brush, in my opinion. I believe art should be experienced as widely and as much as possible, and I think this book does a really good job of exploring that through the lens of book publication. So, yeah, if you're interested in any of that, I would recommend this. It's as I said, it's maybe a little bit dry. It's not, action-packed. It's not full of, suspense and mystery and stuff, but the characters are drawn very delicately and honestly, I think, and just the world that it's exploring is just endlessly fascinating, in my opinion. So if you're interested in literature at all, I think you might get a real kick out of this. So yeah, I'll definitely have to check out more Michener. I don't know if I'm ready for any of his like big chonkers yet, but if he has anything else out there that's kind of like this, let me know. I own a ton of his books. I've got like Centennial next to me. I've got Hawaii. I've got The Source. I've got tons of his books all over the place, so yeah, if you have any favorites that particularly stick out to you, let me know, because I really enjoyed this and I'd like to read more. So yeah, that was the novel. Next, I read something very different. This is a nonfiction book from the library. Slenderman, Online Obsession, Mental Illness, and the Violent Crime of Two Midwestern Girls by Kathleen Hale. Kathleen Hale was a writer for Vice who covered the Slenderman stabbings, which this story deals with, obviously. And I started this in October because I wanted to read some like true crime stuff for Spooky Month. Got distracted by other things, finally finished it. And yeah, this is a really good read, but an immensely angering read. I don't want to get too much into things because there's a lot of stuff in this book about, real people and about politics and things, and that's not really the focus of this channel, but I will say, if you only know the Slenderman story from kind of what you've heard, on the news and things like that, I would definitely recommend reading this book, because I think this does a very good job of setting the record straight. There was the whole media circus around the Slenderman stabbings was just completely ridiculous and irresponsible, making it seem like creepypasta corrupted these two perfectly innocent girls. But one of the things I learned from reading this was that the main girl who orchestrated the stabbing was severely early onset schizophrenic, inherited it from her father, who was kind of ashamed of his own schizophrenia and hid it. And there was a lot of sort of willful ignorance when she started exhibiting symptoms, such as, talking to people that weren't there and stuff like that. In addition to obviously going into the crime itself, it goes into, the whole court proceedings, which I had no idea about, but honestly, in my opinion, it was a complete miscarriage of justice. The way that these girls were 12 when they committed this act, and I want to make it clear, what they did was horrible. I do not approve of what they did at all, but the courts just completely ignored any extenuating circumstances, the fact that they were 12 years old, the fact that the main orchestrator was suffering from extreme mental illness, like this wasn't just like, occasional delusions or hallucinations, like this was full-on psychosis that she was dealing with. And of course got even worse after she was arrested. A lot of things that were just completely ignored. They were tried as adults. This goes a lot into the whole super predator myth of the 90s, about how, urban environments are breeding, super predator children who are like remorseless killers and monsters and stuff like that. And it's just really sickening how these two girls were dehumanized and just completely shoved through the system and just not given any recompense for any of their issues. They were just kind of shoved in a cage and forgotten about, and it just made me so angry. And of course, I have sympathy for the victim. What happened to the victim was awful, but it's kind of what they say about seeking. Before you seek revenge, you must dig two graves, and I think this kind of feels true to that. And also, and another sort of hoary old cliche, but it's true. Two things can be true at once. This was a horrible crime that was committed, but I think there was also a miscarriage of justice in the way that this crime was handled. And I think if you read this book, you'll see where I'm coming from. So yeah, again, I don't want to go too much into more detail than that, because again, I'm not a political channel, I'm not a political analyst, but I thought this book did a really good job of exploring all of the arguments that were made in favor of, of trying the girls the way that they were tried and refuting a lot of those arguments. It's not the most, prettily written book. It's very sparse, it's very simplistic. It's not going to win any awards for writing, I don't think, but it's a very clear-eyed account of what happened and how it happened, and to some extent why it happened. And I just thought it was really insightful and really interesting. So yeah, if you're interested at all in the case but you don't know anything about it, I would definitely check this out. So yeah, there you go, Slenderman. I needed something different after that, so I decided to finally finish off this book that I had started a while ago. This is Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb. This is the third book in the Farseer trilogy, which is part of her larger Realm of the Elderlings series. I read the first book last year, or I read the second book last year, and I think I read the first book the year before that as well. So I've just kind of been taking these a little bit here and there at a time. And again, I was a little bit intimidated by this one because this is a big one, 757 pages. And it took me a little while to get through because, as I said, I was distracted by a lot of other things. But yeah, again, similar to the second book, I thought this was really, really great. Essentially, this deals with the aftermath of the second book, which I don't want to get too into detail because, spoilers, but this deals with the aftermath of the second book. Fitz is incredibly broken and traumatized after all of that, and it deals with him going on a quest to find King Verity, who disappeared in the second book, looking for these things called the Elderlings, which are these mythical creatures who are said to have helped the country of the Six Duchies in a previous time. And that's essentially the plot of the book. It's a one long quest, sort of a Lord of the Rings kind of thing. A long, arduous quest from one place to another. But yeah, I just thought this was brilliant. I think Robin Hobb's writing is gorgeous. The way that she just digs into sort of the psychology of people, especially of Fitz, because we spend all the time in his head. Fitz is a fascinating character, full of contradictions, full of, fear and anger and trauma, and there's a lot of stuff in the book about sort of his endless devotion to his king and how kind of because of that, and because of, all the various things that he's involved with, that's basically all that he has to give. All he has to give is his devotion and his strength, and in doing so he has to kind of give up everything else around him, any attempt at a normal life, and it's very sad. But at the same time, there's a triumphant quality to the ending. Again, not going to spoil it, but I just thought it was all very satisfying. The reveal of exactly what the Elderlings were and how they worked, and and one other thing I also love is the Fool. The Fool, I think, is one of Hobb's greatest characters. He's, endlessly enigmatic, witty, funny, just entertaining to be around. But he also has his own moments of sadness and darkness and trauma, and hurt and anger. We get little shades of him, that turn him into more than just, a fool, a jester. He becomes more than that. And throughout this book, he and Fitz have some very strong homoerotic vibes, which, from what I gather, is intentional and apparently only increases as the series goes on. So I look forward to reading more about that. So yeah, I love the Fool and I love the Fitz. I love their relationship together. They're really kind of the heart of the book, I think. Him, the Fool, Fitz, the Fool, and Night Eyes, his pet wolf. Night Eyes, I think, is Robin Hobb's other greatest character. I love it when fantasy writers are able to explore the minds of animal characters in a way where, they have intelligence, they have sentience, but they still feel different from us. And I think she does a really good job with that, with Night Eyes in this. How he sees the world differently and perceives things and has a different morality and things, because he's a wolf. He's not human. He doesn't think like we do. But at the same time, him and Fitz have this incredibly strong, witted bond that is just incredibly powerful. More powerful in a lot of ways than any of the other relationships in the series, in this trilogy anyway. And I just thought it was brilliant. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this book. I'm definitely going to keep reading the Elderling series. I don't know when I'm going to get to the next book because it's even longer than this. It's like 810 pages or something, and I'm not really ready for another really long book at this point. But I'll give it a bit and I will get to the next one. But yeah, I really, really enjoyed that Assassin's Quest. And then finally, I have another library book. It Came from the Closet, Queer Reflections on Horror, edited by Joe Vallese. I don't know how you pronounce it. But this was just something I heard about randomly, I think just online or somewhere, and my library had a copy of it, so I decided to check it out. Obviously, the intersection between queerness and an affinity for horror is very, very closely intertwined. It's something that's been written about endlessly. And this book, as it says, is a collection of essays exploring horror from a queer perspective. Each essay talks about a different movie, mostly classics, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of really interesting things too. I had kind of mixed feelings about this book. It's kind of in thirds. A third of it is like just kind of very surface level interpretations, queer interpretations of horror films, which isn't bad, for people who kind of need that sort of queer theory 101 thing, but, for someone who's already acquainted with a lot of those themes and ideas, it was a little bit, pedestrian for me, honestly. The other third is, sort of autobiographical pieces that kind of wedge in queerness and horror in there somewhere, which are interesting, but not as much as what I wanted. And then the last third, which is more what I really enjoyed, are essays on, actual insightful essays on horror films read through a queer lens that interpret them in radically unique ways that help you look at the film in a different perspective than you would have thought before. That was more of what I wanted, and in that sense, there's a lot of really good essays in here that are based around that theme. One of my favorites was Both Ways by Carmen Maria Machado, which is about the film Jennifer's Body, where she talks about sort of how it was accused of queer baiting when it came out, and it was kind of unfairly maligned. She really goes into a really radical queer rereading of the film that makes it into an element of empowerment rather than queer baiting, which I thought was really interesting. There's also Indescribable by Caro Narvi about the Blob and the 1989 film Society, where they make a very, very strong case for the queerness of blobs. It sounds crazy, but it makes perfect sense, and it's very persuasive in the essay. Most of us wouldn't think of a blob as queer, but they say a lot of really interesting things in their essay about how the blob is like this immutable, indescribable figure that kind of fills people with revulsion, much like a lot of queer people, and how sort of the the point of the Blob, especially in the remake, which it primarily focuses on, is about coming into this, all-American town, with like your typical heteronormative things, and kind of destroying it and digesting them and making it a part of itself, making all of these heteronormative things part of its sort of indescribable, unidentifiable self. And I thought that was a really interesting way of looking at it. It made me want to watch the movie again. That was a really good one. I also really enjoyed Centered and Seen by Sumiko Salson, which is about Candyman and goes into the original Candyman and the new version of Candyman that came out recently, and it explores both of those films through the lens of black pain. How often, because they're very black stories. The first one, which is a classic, but it is made by a white man and it is from a white perspective. That's just undeniable. Z go into they use neopronouns, so I'm trying to be respectful. Z goes into all of that with a lot of just humor and insight, and just it was just very beautifully written. And at the end of it, there's this wonderful moment where they're at this sort of big family reunion. And a little bit kind of like apprehensive about it because they're out and queer, and non-binary, very against the norm, and they're approached by two younger people, and they ask them what their pronouns are, and they tell them what their pronouns are, and then they share their pronouns, and then they end up dancing together, and it's this really nice moment of like togetherness and how and all this stuff. And yeah, I just really, really liked it. That was a really great one. Some of the essays in here left me feeling a bit weird, like aside from the ones that are just kind of very surface level and like, hey, did you know that queer readings can be made into movies? Like, yeah, I knew that. That's why I'm reading this book. Some of them were a bit weird. There was this one, it's The Trail of His Flames by Tucker Lieberman, which ostensibly is about Nightmare on Elm Street, but he really uses it as a way of exploring a falling out he had with a friend in 2015 and like trauma and stuff like that. Their friend apparently was very mentally ill and had to be sectioned, and I guess the friend saw that as kind of a betrayal. And it was just really strange because, I mean, far be it from me to gatekeep how people discuss trauma, but a lot of it just seemed very like, honestly, like they were making it about themselves rather than focusing on their friend who apparently was really hurting and going through a lot of terrible stuff, and how they kind of took it on and made it about like, oh, this bad experience I had with my friend really traumatized me, and was kind of making it all about themselves. I mean, again, I'm not trying to gatekeep trauma, but just something about it just, I don't know, it didn't sit right with me. It just felt a bit weird. There's little things like that. So overall, I've kind of mixed feelings on this collection, but there are some really interesting essays in here, and I really hope that, as the introduction by Joe Vallese says, it came from the closet should not be read as definitive, which signifies a conclusion, but as a vibrant continuation of a dialogue that began long before I conceived of and curated this project, and will undoubtedly continue far beyond its pages. I hope so too. I hope this really opens up a new realm of queer theory and horror. I hope we get lots more books like this. I would love to read them. If you guys know of any sort of nonfiction books that discuss horror through like a queer lens, please let me know. I would love to read more. But yeah, for me anyway, this is a bit of a mixed bag. It wasn't exactly what I wanted or expected out of it, but there was a lot of really interesting essays and writing and authors in here. So yeah, your mileage may vary. I thought it was interesting, good, not great, but as a beginning to a conversation, I think it's really invaluable, and I hope we get more like it in the future. So yeah, there you go. There's It Came From the Closet, and that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, sorry for taking so long to get this out. I'm a terrible YouTuber. I apologize, but hopefully you guys enjoyed. Have you read any of these books? Have you read any of these authors? What did you think of them? What would you recommend I read next if you've read any of these authors before, especially the Michener, like I mentioned. If you've read any Michener, let me know what you prefer. Where should I go? Where should I start next? That kind of thing. But yeah, until then, I'll see you guys later. Bye.